Hiring for your small business? If you're not looking for professionals on LinkedIn, you're looking in the wrong place. That's like looking for your car keys in a fish tank. LinkedIn helps you hire professionals you can't find anywhere else, even those who aren't actively searching for a new job but might be open to the perfect role. In a given month, over 70% of LinkedIn users don't even visit other leading job sites. So start looking in the right place. With LinkedIn, you can hire professionals like a professional. Post your free job on linkedin.com/spoken today.
Millions of people have lost weight with personalized plans from Noom. Like Evan, who can't stand salads and still lost 50 pounds.
Salads generally for most people are the easy button, right? For me, that wasn't an option. I never really was a salad guy. That's just not who I am. But Noom worked for me.
Get your personalized plan today at Noom.com. Real Noom user compensated to provide their story. In 4 weeks, the typical Noom user can expect to lose 1 to 2 pounds per week. Individual results may vary.
Since 2013, Bombas has donated over 100 million socks, underwear, and T-shirts to those facing homelessness. If we counted those on air, this ad would last over 1,157 days. But if we counted the time it takes to make a donation possible, it would take just a few clicks. Because every time you make a purchase, Bombas donates an item to someone who needs it.
Go to bombas.com/ACAST and use code ACAST for 20% off your first purchase. That's bombas.com/ACAST, code ACAST.
Hello, folks, and welcome back to the Napoleonicist. It's time for another monthly installment of Marshal Madness. You seem to absolutely love these episodes. I'm not remotely surprised. The OG of this, the one on Davoo, is currently number 6 on the all-time favorite downloads for this podcast on 2000 and I think it's 69 listens. He says, frantically trying to reach for his tracking data to verify this. I do you a disservice, in fact, Rachel. 2,166 downloads, which is, as I say, number 6 on the all-time. We had a review come in, actually. I say we, the royal we here, the grandiose royal we. I'm turning into Napoleon, this is awful. A review came in as Rachel kind of bows and curtsies sarcastically to me. I walked straight into that one. We had a review come in very recently that mentioned Rachel by name. This was from RZB, which said, this superb podcast just gets better and better with its wide-ranging topics, e.g. science and music, so not just the blood and thunder stuff. And knowledgeable and entertaining contributors. The new monthly series on Napoleon's Marshals with Rachael Stark is brilliant. She's a great find. I look forward to more. Well, with reviews like that, how could we not deliver? And boy, have we got one that's going to get your tongues wagging tonight, because we've done probably one of the most famous ones in Davoo. We've done one of the more forgotten ones in the form of MacDonald. Why don't we just throw our toys out the pram and have a big argument next? That was our thinking when we planned this one. So we're talking Bernadotte, one of a couple that many, many people just love to hate. I am, of course, joined by the brilliant Rachael Stark to talk me through all of this. I can't wait for this because I had happened to know that you and I think on very similar lines when it comes to Bernadotte. We seem absolutely to be a minority in that score. How are you doing, Rachel? How have you been?
Not too bad, thank you. Yeah, no, I actually tweeted about Bernadotte earlier on this week, and my mentions just went of people alternately going, oh, he was brilliant, and equally going, he was a traitor, he was rubbish, he, betrayed his country and so on. He does seem to bring out the argumentative in people, regardless of which side you stand on.
So is it fair to say, and we'll deal with the reasons and the history behind it all in due course, but is it fair to say that your stance on Bernadotte often kind of ties into your stance on Napoleon and what your expectations are of Napoleon's subordinates when it comes to blind loyalty versus other considerations that may or may not be something to factor in.
Yeah, definitely. I think I go neither saint nor sinner regarding Napoleon, and I often sort of think that with some of the more controversial marshals, Bernadotte being one, Marmont being the other, and Grouchy, people's sort of standards or benchmarks vary quite drastically depending on who their overall allegiance, if I can use that word, belongs to. And I'm very happy for people to have whatever stance you take on a marshal, because everybody will interpret things in a different way. But what's good for the goose has got to be good for the gander. And if you're going to look at it critically, you need to be consistent. You can't admire a trait in one person and castigate another for having those exact same personality traits or taking these same actions just because you happen to have a personal dislike of them.
Yeah, that is well said. Look at you coming in with like balance and reasonable arguments. This cannot be tolerated. That so many of my guests on the Napoleonicists are trying to give like reasonable suggestions. No, we need memes. We need memes. We cannot have, carefully thought out positions. It's just not acceptable. Obviously, I'm being sarcastic and taking the pop at the more extreme, who just want blind loyalty and vive l'empereur. And I'm very sorry, but if you haven't worked it out by now, that really isn't the tone of this podcast. It tends to be me bashing Napoleon, occasionally acknowledging some good points, people bringing me back into line, which is fair, because sometimes I'm sure I take the argument too far, but that's the point of it. It's about the discussion. So hey, let's just get straight on with it, and let's talk origins. I was doing a bit of reading because I need to when it comes to the marshals, and inevitably we don't get through this without drawing upon Chandler in some sense. It seems that he goes on a bit of a tangent joining the army. This isn't the plan, is it?
No, and that's actually a fairly consistent theme for a lot of the marshalate. The vast, well, maybe not the vast majority, but a good hefty percentage of them were not intended for military life. And another one of the sort of recurrent themes seems to be the loss of their fathers, either in youth or in adolescence, and this is true of Bernadotte again. So he was born in Pau in January 1763, which makes him Gascon by birth and very much Gascon by personality. He adheres to literally every stereotype. And his birthplace actually is still extant. You can visit it and you'll find the tricolour and the Swedish flag flying in unison appropriately. But he was the son of Henri Bernadotte, who was a prosecutor at the Royal Court of Justice in Pau. And he was named Jean-Baptiste. They added the Baptiste later to differentiate him from his brother, also called Jean, and they called him Jean Evangeliste. So you can see the theme. But the intention very much was for Jean-Baptiste Bernadotte that he would follow his father into the legal profession, and he was apprenticed to an attorney at 14. So he very much was on the bottom rungs of a legal career. And his father died when he was 17, and that essentially was the end of said legal career. And he decided he was for the army. And he'd been bowled over by a recruiting sergeant who'd come through Pau, and who'd apparently known his family and had got chatting to the young Bernadotte and had let him try on his jacket. And it was agreed by both parties that it actually became him very well, that he suited it, he was very smart, and that he'd make a very dashing soldier. And then the story goes, the recruiting sergeant said, I send you off now to become a Marshal of France. But I suspect that's apocryphal, because I think it would just be a little bit too good to be true. And off he went, and he enlisted.
This does kind of... So there are two things I want to pick up on here. This father connection, this is speculation. To what extent do you think a gravitation towards Napoleon is kind of an indication of seeking a fatherly figure in these men's lives? Or is it just happenstance that, is this just a product of society that, people die, and so actually it's not that remarkable that all of these guys lose their father. It just kind of struck me as an odd one, because we often talk about Napoleon and his ability to work people and play them, and the tug the ear, and that kind of paternal side to his character that he could draw upon.
It's I've never thought about it that way before. I mean, obviously Napoleon was younger than most of them, with the exception of Marmont and Davout. But it's an interesting point. I've genuinely never thought about it that way, and it does seem to be a strange kind of recurrence, because also another sort of young man who lost his father young and wound up in a career he wasn't intended for was, of course, Wellington. So it's a funny old sort of set of coincidences that set these characters off on the path that they will actually take them to the Napoleonic Wars.
The other one that struck me when I was prepping for this was he's intended for the law. That's a profession that has a certain status attached to it. You know, that is not rank and file of the army during the Ancien Regime. And so it really kind of surprised me that he makes this jump. Basically, he takes a step backwards in social status in order to almost act on this whim. There's a kind of impetuosity there.
Yeah.
That surprised me quite a lot. How do the family react to this idea that he's just up sticks and gone and joined the army and kind of done that thing that you wouldn't expect somebody of that status, those means, and that education, let's not forget, he's educated to become a lawyer. You wouldn't expect this of someone like that.
No, I haven't found that much detail about his remaining family. He was the third child to survive in infancy, and obviously his mother was left behind. But I have in accounts of other marshals who've done very similar and turned their backs on what would have been considered really safe careers to go to war. It was been noted multiple times that it was sort of the despair of their mothers, because if you have somebody ready to go into this very prestigious or at least very safe career, I can't imagine it goes down particularly well. Although obviously nobody ever considering he'd have finished his military career on the Swedish throne.
This is true. I mean, it does end up going quite well for him. Let's not forget that. But it doesn't. He doesn't kind of get gifted this on a silver platter. This is earned. Let's bear in mind, this is Ancien Regime when he starts his career. He has no pretensions of, for all that we have this probably apocryphal comment about send you off to become a Marshal of France. In reality, he wouldn't necessarily have expected to make that jump. His goal would be, if he was career-minded, would be non-commissioned officer ranks, end up as sergeant major. Who knows beyond that? But, you know, an expectation of your career peaking at sergeant major, it wouldn't have been unusual. So he does incredibly well. Talk us through that rise, obviously revolution and all the rest of it.
So as you say, his early career actually is a very positive one. He was noted as being extremely diligent, he was quick to learn, he was smart, he was attentive, he was well turned out, and he was very keen to do well. So he ended up serving 11 years in the ranks before he was commissioned. He became a corporal in 1785. 3 months later, he was a sergeant. At the age of 25, he was a sergeant major. And just in the outbreak of the revolution, he was regimental sergeant major, which was as high as he possibly could have gone. And that was still under the age of 30. And when you consider that promotion was by no means as rapid as it would be under the revolution, that's a pretty impressive, CV. And he was very well regarded by his men. They called him Sergeant Belgian because he was very well turned out, and apparently they thought he had good legs, which is, there's worse nicknames to have.
I mean, it's a nice asset to have, right?
Yeah.
I mean, Murat made the most of a good thigh game, so why not Bernadotte?
So yeah, it was a very promising career, and it was in 1791, 11 years after he first enlisted. So that, as you say, this isn't somebody who's just sort of breezed in and been awarded a commission. He has done the grafting. He was first commissioned as lieutenant.
There are a couple of things to draw out here. One is the discipline element. I think, and this is something that obviously will feed through into our discussions, I imagine, later. But I get the impression this is a guy who would have liked the lash, and would have been almost kind of Wellingtonian in his dissemination of the lash, given the opportunity. Obviously, different system in the French army, so opportunity is often not there. But talk us through that kind of stickler for discipline. Why do we have any sense of why and where that comes from, and kind of examples of it?
He was just not just being particularly efficient in his dealings. He liked things in good order. So I think you're probably right in that there are sort of parallels or similarities with Wellington. He liked the job done, and he liked it done well, on time, efficiently. He abhorred looting, and this takes it a little bit further in his career, but he abhorred looting. He would brook no interference with private property. He expected his men to follow his example and behave, and it was probably the sole thing that he and Marshal Bernadotte ever agreed on, because they hated each other, but they were both very much about good behaviour, and it meant that both their respective corps could be trusted to do a job and not wreak havoc on the population they were passing through.
Yeah, you can't help but wonder if the legal training within him, it might be part of the reason why he was one of these people who had an issue with people being what's a euphemistic way of putting this? People being inventive with whether or not something was an item that belonged in their pocket or not. Because, of course, for folks who aren't familiar, there is this kind of concept with ancien regime society that property is kind of everything. And there's talk in some historian circles about a deification of property rights within the law, i.e. this idea that you protect the fact that people own stuff before anything else. And that's why you see some of the harshest punishments for things like theft within the non-military legal system. So it's curious. It's a curious one in terms of whether or not that is a feeder through from that. But in any case, we'll talk more about that in due course. The anecdote that's really sprung to mind from my reading was an instance during the revolution when some individuals start complaining and they want certain things out of Bernadotte, and I forget who it is who's this is the one, yeah. And so they've got this revolutionary kind of inspector, if you like. This guy is sort of there to make sure that everybody's kind of pro-revolution, and anybody who's not is going to be weeded out, and what's going to happen to them in the long run. And so these two guys pitch up, and they're complaining about the conditions, and they want changes. And Bernadotte is called for, just pulls out the flat of his sword, just starts whacking them with it until they naff off. And this completely baffles the inspector, but it kind of makes the point. Okay, this guy's on our side. He's not kind of letting anybody get away with anything. Which is why you kind of get this sense that, well, if he's prepared to physically beat people in the presence of some incredibly senior people within the French government, he's quite a stickler for discipline. And we should stay with that kind of revolutionary period element, shouldn't we? Because it's quite obviously it's part of the reason why a number of the marshals have that meteoric rise. So talk us through that transition, first of all, from NCO to, if you like, CO, commissioned officer.
Yeah, so he became a lieutenant, as I say, in 1791 after 11 years in the ranks. Some of his first service was in Corsica, funnily enough. And he, just kind of tying us quite neatly in with the topic of his temper. One of his early major engagements was at, and I'm probably pronouncing this horrifically, Rüsselsheim. And in the French advance guard, they started to panic, and some of the men sort of started backing away, and they were on the verge of having a bit of a retreat. And what follows is from Bernadotte's own account. I shouted, sometimes cursed, and I begged and commanded, but my voice went unheard. Bullets flew all around, and I escaped many by striking the muskets aside with the point of my sword. I rushed to the head of the battalion, whose conditions had become critical, and my horse fell, but I did not lose my head. Soldiers, I shouted, assembled here. There must be no more retreating. You can make a stand here, I know it. Your bayonets and your courage are your defence. Those who flee are unworthy of freedom. We will stand fast at our posts and die too, if need be, with the cry, long live the Republic, long live the nation, form up. And there's quite a lot more. And he essentially says, speech making, convincing decision, regained obedience to orders were the work of a minute. And the soldiers sort of rallied to his cause. And he claims, anyway, he saved the day. But that is a sort of recurrent theme in Bernadotte's career, in that he makes an excellent speech. He is very, very good, and they use the term sort of his gasconades, his sort of very emotive outbursts that we associate with the inhabitants of that part of France. And he gives sort of grandiose proclamations, and he's very, very good at being very charismatic and getting his men back on side, which is something that does not massively endear him to Napoleon in the future, because he doesn't always say what Napoleon wants him to say, and very often goes against Napoleon's wishes. But he's very good at sort of turning the situation around and rallying his men. And on another occasion, when he had started climbing the ranks, and we'll come to his sort of major year in a minute, he had been appointed the colonel of the 71st Demi Brigade, who were not very much to his satisfaction. And on another occasion, when his soldiers were retreating, he was so incandescent with rage, he ripped off his own epaulets, threw them at some of the retreating soldiers, and basically said, "I'm absolutely disgusted to be your officer. If you're going to behave like that, I don't want to be associated with you." And, was almost apoplectic with fury. He was a very emotive, temperamental man.
Yeah, it comes across. I mean, it's interesting that we talk about sort of those Gascony stereotypes, not least because I believe I was reading that D'Artagnan may have been kind of crafted from Alexandre Dumas' kind of studies of Bernadotte and what he was like. Is that right?
I've read that as well. I don't know how true that is. But it's an interesting concept, because when you think of D'Artagnan and the Three Musketeers sort of coming to Paris, and he immediately challenges the Three Musketeers to duels, it's not wholly unlike Bernadotte, who could have picked a fight with his own shadow if he'd found enough cause. He was not a man to back away from an argument.
No, I think we'll see plenty of examples of that in just a second. But let's talk about how we go from a guy who's a captain to becoming a general in the space of a single year. This is kind of dizzying in terms of how rapid. Not to say that it's undeserved. He demonstrates why, that faith was well placed, and he'd certainly proven himself earlier in his career. But why is it so quick? Because that's insane. Captain to general in less than 12 months.
Yeah, 1794, his ascension is meteoric and faster than Napoleon himself ever had gone through those ranks. And I don't think comparable to any other marshal either. It's just sort of almost impossible to get your head around. So he began the year as a captain. In April, he became the colonel of that 71st Demi Brigade, who he really didn't care very much for at all. Later that year, he played a very major part in the Battle of Fleurus. It was primarily Jourdan's victory, though, and the sort of thing that really struck me about Bernadotte is when we look at all the other marshals, you can more or less pinpoint a finest hour or a sort of premier victory. And I'm not really sure Bernadotte has one of those. He plays an important part in a lot of other people's finest hours. I'm not entirely convinced he has one himself. But he did, was instrumental, even not incremental, to the victory at Fleurus, and was rewarded by being promoted General of Division. So by the end of 1794, he was Sergeant Belgium no more. He was General Belgium.
Do we have a sense of how he dealt with that change? Because for all that, yes, he goes on to demonstrate ability, to go from you're a captain to suddenly you're a general of division, the duties are just leagues apart. So I remember reading that, the following year is very much about, consolidation and kind of focusing on his duties. I think he's made Commandant of Maastricht, I want to say, at one point. Um, so does he take time to adjust, or does he just seem to be born to this?
He just seems to be one of those people who has a very strong natural ability. He was a good administrator as well. And there seems to sort of be a great divide in the Marshalate. There you have the ones who were excellent administrators, Berthier obviously, but Davout, Mortier, Lefebvre was a good administrator, and so on, and the ones to whom staff work was not their, or administration generally was not their forte. But Bernadotte does well. He is, again, efficiency seems to be his watchword. He's very organized. He has high standards. He likes a job done well, but again, demonstrates a fanatically Gascon temper. He once challenges his own chief of staff to a duel because he thinks the man has taken a bribe. And when he marched into Altdorf, the staff or the academics from the university had come to him and sort of pleaded to be recused the need to take billeted troops. And he just goes off on one and sort of tells them to get back to university and do as expected, or he'll burn their whole flipping university to the ground. So diplomacy, perhaps not just his great points in the way that administration and organisation are, but he does have a very keen sense of honour to complement that, because when the Parisian press actually incorrectly claim that he had sacked Nuremberg and sort of had over-exaggerated the commotion at Altdorf, he's so disgusted and irate that he's on the cusp of resigning and sort of has to be talked out of it. So touchy, yes, argumentative also, but he has a very keen sense of his own personal reputation and won't stand for it being sullied.
He's also quite politically savvy, which is something that we should talk about, because this is the French Revolutionary period. Governments are coming and going with almost alarming regularity. And he's present at Fructidor, I'm going to ruin the pronunciation here, Prayrau and Brumaire, and very deliberately, it seems, just doesn't get involved. Kind of looks almost like the archetypal fence sitter in terms of knowing that whichever way it goes, you don't want to have been on the wrong side of it. So better to just not take a side and then deal with the fallout of that, because of course better to have done nothing than to have opposed the winning side.
Yeah, absolutely. He was the sort of fence sitter extraordinaire, but he was incredibly politically savvy, definitely more so than any other of the marshals. The only one who sort of comes within a league of him is Marshal Suchet, but in some ways certainly even more savvy than Napoleon. He can sort of read sometimes situations better than Napoleon can. And yeah, so he, in each case, he is very keen to make it clear that he is steadfastly loyal to the Republic. He is not effectively going to get his hands dirty unless he is given direct orders by the government that he needs to do so, and these orders never come. And he had clashed with Napoleon pre-Brumaire in Italy, where he claimed that he had been sent to blockade Gradisca, and he claimed Napoleon was only sending him there because Napoleon was jealous of him. He then achieved his objective, and Napoleon berated him for being too reckless. And that whole interaction just sets the tone for their entire working relationship. But Napoleon did directly appeal to him at Brumaire for his support. And he's not the only marshal who declines to support Napoleon. I mean, some of them were directly opposed to him, Jourdan, for example. But he won't commit. He very carefully keeps his hands clean until he fully understands which way the wind is going to blow. And then he goes with it at the last minute. And it stands him in good stead. It's not a period where taking risks necessarily always paid off. I mean, there were plenty of generals, obviously Napoleon, where ambition and risk was infinitely rewarded. But they weren't shy of chucking generals at the scaffold. There were plenty of good commanders, good generals went for the chop for being, too reckless, too ambitious, or conversely, not reckless and not ambitious enough. It was a very fine line to walk, and Bernadotte walked it very, very well.
He absolutely did. What you're saying there actually reminds me of a technique I use to teach my students about just how fine a line it could be in terms of getting it right at a very specific moment in time. And just kind of, and what we did was trace Napoleon's career and, kind of, can you survive the revolution? And so I take them off to Egypt, and not literally, obviously. And, the abandonment of the armies, it's the right call, the wrong call, through to the Brumaire coup and what's the right call, what's the wrong call. And you haven't supported the government back along, so you end up being executed, all of these kinds of things. And I once had a student who literally made the wrong call every single time and must have been executed about 4 times in the course of this exercise. It was quite hilarious, but it just goes to show how dangerous this is.
Well, when you look at the rest of the martialate, when you look at how close some of the rest of them had, I mean, we discussed in the Davout episode how close Davout had come and his family to being arraigned and sent to the scaffold. Jourdan's arrest warrant was actually signed by Robespierre, and it was only through the intervention of another officer that Jourdan kept his head. Kellerman was imprisoned at a point during the revolution as well, and only really staved off execution because they kept putting other people in front of him. It was a very, very dangerous time. And I mean, Napoleon himself was at one point a very close associate of Augustin Robespierre. And he was very lucky that he was able to distance himself in the way that he did, or he could have gone likewise.
Do we have any sense of his political leanings and what he believed in, or was it a case that he wasn't overly fussed, just, kind of leave me out of it?
On the face of it, he was certainly volubly Jacobin. And he allegedly had a tattoo which says, some sources differ, either death to kings or death to tyrants. And I really love the idea of it, but most Swedish sources seem to say that that's a legend and that he had no such tattoo. Although it would have been terrific to have a king with the tattoo death to kings. It would have been a fairly interesting sort of plot twist, but he was certainly, on the face of it, volubly Jacobin when he needed to be.
Yeah, it's remarkable how often people are when they need to be, and then can be something else when the occasion arises. We've talked a bit already about the difficult relationship with Napoleon. One thing that I do want to pick up on is that it gets worse, right? And that's tied in with the marriage to Desiree. Apologies, if I remember this rightly, he meets Desiree kind of by chance when she's 12 and he's 25, I want to say. And then their paths cross subsequently. So perhaps we should probably talk about the marriage first, and then why this kind of exacerbates the situation with Napoleon.
Yeah, he had supposed to be billeted at their family home in his early career, and Desiree had apparently noted that in her diary. But yes, Desiree Clary, I mean, you could do a whole hour on her life alone, never mind just as a marshal's wife, had been engaged to Napoleon, who she'd met after her sister had become engaged to Joseph Bonaparte. And you can use the term engagement very loosely. Napoleon treated the poor lassie like a self-improvement project. When you look at the letters he sent her, it was all about what she should read and what she should do and how she should improve herself. And he did sort of treat her like a project. And there was nothing like the sort of incredibly passionate correspondence he had with Josephine. And of course, the minute Josephine comes on the scene, he's finished with Desiree. But he did maintain a regard for her. And of course, along comes Bernadotte and they get married, which then makes Bernadotte brother-in-law to Joseph Bonaparte. So he is an extended member of the Bonaparte clan, very much in the same way that Davout is, because he's become Pauline Bonaparte's brother-in-law. So it's all a bit fractious. because ultimately they are never bosom friends, ever. Their relationship is continuously rocky. Napoleon takes every opportunity he can to criticise Bernadotte, sometimes fairly, quite often unfairly. Bernadotte takes every single opportunity he can to undermine Napoleon, very deliberately, very provocatively. He issues proclamations that clash with what Napoleon has said. On one occasion, when they're supposed to send dispatches back to the Directory, Bernadotte sends his own, which sort of countermand some of what Napoleon has said instead of putting them through Napoleon. And they both treat Desiree appallingly, because they use her to they manipulate her, and they use her to play, each other off, because Bernadotte knows that she's retained a regard, that Napoleon's retained a regard for her. Obviously, Napoleon realizes that she is now Bernadotte's wife, so they both sort of wheedle and push at her and try and sort of make her piggy in the middle as they play her off against each other. And ultimately, I think if you were asking Napoleon to rate his marshals, even pre-St. Helena, Bernadotte was probably the one he cared about the least. In Laon and Bessières and Marmont, there was very genuine bonds of friendship, and I would probably say he genuinely loved all three. In Davout and Massena and Suchet and Soult and Ney, he could have a respect for their martial abilities. Bernadotte was neither friend, and though he had a good career, nor was he a brilliant general. If we were going to rank the marshals in terms of ability, I'm usually putting Bernadotte somewhere around lower middle. I certainly don't put him anything like near Massena or Davout or Ney or Soult. So it was a funny old kind of position to be in, because he had no claim on Napoleon's friendship and only limited claim on his professional regard. And they just were not two men who were suited to working together.
The next question, I'm afraid, is a predictable one, which is, why bother? Why keep it going if you hate each other this much? Why, in Bernadotte's case, not resign? Why, in Napoleon's case, I mean, we'll get to the why elevate him to a marshal, but why not just get rid of the guy? Make him redundant, make him resign, put him on half pay, send him back to a nice little chateau somewhere. Job done. Yeah. Because from what you say, ability, this isn't sort of your top 5 marshals that we're dealing with here. So why is the inclination to keep with it?
Ultimately, they needed each other. Bernadotte was popular. He was not the best of all the generals, but he was very well regarded, particularly by his men. He had a good reputation, and by very carefully fence-sitting, he hadn't really peeved off any particular faction. He'd kept his hands clean. And Napoleon needed decent generals, and he couldn't afford to isolate big groups of the army by getting rid of popular generals. And equally, Bernadotte, in his sort of typical savviness, realized that after Brumaire, Napoleon was the direction of France, and he could either go with it or be left behind. And ultimately, he chose to go with it, and he benefited from it, of course, because despite the fact that I've just said about Napoleon not having massive regard for him and certainly not being a friend, he was as generous to the marshals he wasn't fond of as he was to the ones he genuinely loved. And Bernadotte was the first of the marshalate, besides Berthier, to be made a prince. He was made Prince of Pontecorvo. So he wasn't being incredibly ill-treated. He was making a sort of tidy profit in terms of endowments and titles. And that was much to Desiree's chagrin, because she thought she was going to have to leave France when they got that title, foreshadowing of things to come. But relationship of convenience, probably they needed each other.
Interesting, the way that the pragmatism comes to the fore there where it's needed. We should talk about battlefield record, especially having sort of said, well, he's not perhaps the greatest. Auerstadt is one that we'll get to, because we need to talk about the Davos situation, I suspect, in the run-up to that. But there's obviously a span of time from what we've just talked about, the Brumaire through to Auerstadt. So talk us through that phase of his career and the route towards the Marshal, say.
Yeah, I mean, ultimately, his sort of pre or early Marshal's career was pretty positive. He played a good role at Austerlitz, but again, we typically call that Soult, or one of Soult's finest hours. So again, we have this sort of recurrent theme that he renders good service, but he never really gets to be, he's sort of always the bridesmaid, never the bride, to kind of use the cliche. So he is stationed in Hanover. He brought an end to looting there because various other French generals and marshals had liberally been lining their pockets. And as I say, whatever you can criticize Bernadotte for, that is definitely not one of them. He certainly behaved with personal integrity for the most part. And then he took command of the First Corps and commanded the left flank at Austerlitz. And Napoleon still found things to criticise. He basically said the speed of his advance was too slow, and he accused him of crossing the Danube a day late. And that is just basically the continual theme. Even when he does reasonably well, there's always something to criticise. So it's, just not in any way one of the most harmonious working relationships of the Marshalate. In fact, I'd probably go so far as to say, of all the relationships Napoleon had with all of the marshals, this was the worst one.
Do we know the reason behind giving him the baton? Because, I mean, is it just as simple as what you were saying earlier, that this is the guy who carries the army or portions of the army with him, so it looks good to give the guy his baton? Or because from what you're saying, there's always a but, which therefore means that if you don't have that high point, you don't have that moment where you obviously are going to kind of turn around and go, here's your baton. So talk us through that.
So again, I think there's the element of convenience. He couldn't afford to make a true enemy of Bernadotte. But I also think when we talk of pragmatism, nobody was shrewder in terms of pragmatism than Napoleon. And if your enemy, or we'll call him the frenemy of Napoleon, is dependent on you for endowments and titles and the continued sort of nice lifestyle for your wife, of whom Napoleon is very fond, that pays off in the end, because it is through Napoleon that Bernadotte goes from being ultimately good general to marshal and dignity of the new Napoleonic Empire even, and it pays off. So it's through Napoleon that he continues up the societal ladder. So I figure if you've people you're not entirely sure of, it's not a bad thing if they're dependent on your goodwill for their income and their titles.
A lot can happen in 3 years, like a chatbot may be your new best friend. But what won't change? Needing health insurance. United Healthcare Tri-Term Medical Plans, underwritten by Golden Rule Insurance Company, offer flexible, budget-friendly coverage that lasts nearly 3 years in some states. Learn more at uh1.com.
I'm Sandra, and I'm just the professional your small business was looking for. But you didn't hire me because you didn't use LinkedIn Jobs. LinkedIn has professionals you can't find anywhere else, including those who aren't actively looking for a new job, but might be open to the perfect role, like me.
In a given month, over 70% of LinkedIn users don't visit other leading job sites. So if you're not looking on LinkedIn, you'll miss out on great candidates like Sandra. Start hiring professionals like a professional. Post your free job on linkedin.com/spoken today.
Yeah, this is true. Davos, we've got to talk Davos within this. Why?
My God, they hated each other. So Bernadotte had been under observation by Davout, and he had discovered that Davout had read some of his correspondence and went ballistic and had basically threatened to horsewhip Davout. And from that point on, there was no love lost. I mean, Davout wasn't a particularly convivial fellow either, and made enemies just as easily as Bernadotte did. And Bernadotte also had a long-standing feud with Berthier, because upon his arrival in Italy, he arrested one of Berthier's best friends for insubordination. And that began their feud as well. So they sort of existed in a sort of mutual trio of hatred, because they all hated each other.
Did anybody like him? I mean, genuinely, we reach a point where you start to kind of wonder, does he have any friends at all?
He was well regarded by the men he commanded, but amongst the marshal, you sort of see all these other little pockets of friendships. So you have Murat and Bessières, and you have Davout and Oudinot, and various sort of other, convivial relationships where they have their personal enmities, but they also have very good working relationships. And the interesting thing about Bernadotte is he doesn't seem to have that amongst his peers. He's, as I say, there are men who serve with him who regard him very well and who think very highly of him. And he certainly doesn't have a stain in his character for being a spiteful or cruel or, unpleasant commander. But he doesn't seem to have that bond of friendship. I think he was a very difficult man to be friends with. He was incredibly touchy.
It sounds it, and it makes it all the more remarkable that he doesn't kind of have a monumental fall that ends up sort of seeing him either permanently retired forcibly, or even kind of brought before a charge of treason or something to that effect. It's because you need friends to get ahead in this period, and sure, he gets promoted on sheer ability, and that's great, but just as well, really, because patronage was never going to be something that was going to help him out, because he just couldn't seem to maintain those friendships. Shall we talk Auerstadt then?
Yes, so this seems to be the thing. Whenever I put anything up about Marshal Bernadotte, the comments are always traitor, 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 and the offence seems to be that they also think he was a traitor to Davout as well as Napoleon. But, and there is a gigantic but, in as much that I think you can fairly condemn Bernadotte for being touchy and a poor cooperator and generally a bit unpleasant in quite a lot of ways, I don't think you can say Auerstadt was a fault of spite. It was largely an issue, similarly to the way we discussed Grouchy, it was a comms failure. And when you look at the orders that were given out at Auerstadt, that's primarily the cause of the confusion. So there's a really, really great summary of all the kind of critical arguments pro and for Bernadotte at Auerstadt on the Napoleon series online. And it's called Bernadotte 1806, Is There a Case for the Defence? And it's really interesting reading. So it sort of really objectively, critically analyses the orders, the timings, what we can fairly deduce was the result of the issue of these orders. So we know that obviously pre-Jena, Napoleon was anticipating taking on the full might of the Prussian army, and that he miscalculated, and it was Marshal Davout who ran slap bang into them. But if we look at the orders, they were issued based on Napoleon's calculation of what he expected to happen. Now, it's not Napoleon's fault that that was wrong, but it did influence where people were. So if we look at the orders that were sent out on the 12th of October, we see the first one: give orders to Marshal Davout to leave his position for Naumburg, where he must arrive as quickly as possible, always holding his troops ready to fight. And then various other details. Prince Murat and Marshal Bernadotte are also ordered to Naumburg, but they were to follow a different road. So there's no details with regard to the concept of the operations. It is just, you go this way, you go that way. the kind of key focus is on Davout. He must get there first. He's sort of the essential cog in the wheel. And then Berthier sent another order to Murat, basically advising him on the route to take, and he's told he's going to find Davout. He's told nothing about Bernadotte's location or Bernadotte's corps. And then, as I say, the key thing is that Berthier mentions Davout first. He's to arrive as quickly as possible. He's got his road lined out. So he's clearly vital to the success of encircling the army. It's not the others. So you can forgive them for assuming that that was going to be the case. And if we look at the orders sent out on the 14th, Davout receives the following. The Emperor has recognized a Prussian army which stretches a league away before and on the heights of Jena as far as Weimar. He proposes to attack it on the morrow, and he orders Marshal Davout to proceed to Apolda in order to fall on the rear of that army. He leaves the Marshal his choice of route, provided he takes part in the fight. And then there's the postscript. If Marshal Bernadotte is with you, you can march together. But the Emperor hopes that he will be in the position which he has pointed out to him at Dornberg. So it turns out, because Bernadotte has basically done what he was told to, they're opposite sides of Naumburg, and Bernadotte has not received any other orders telling him to do anything else. So he's exactly where Napoleon told him to be, when Napoleon told him to be, and with no possible expectation that Marshal Davout is just going to walk right slap bang into the main Prussian force. Now, it's entirely likely, almost certain, that he will have heard the cannon of Erstadt. And so what I think you can fairly chide Bernadotte is to say that he could potentially have marched to the sound of the cannon. Equally, he should have probably been able to hear the cannon at Jena. So he could have taken his corps in one direction or the other. So you can fairly say he showed a lack of initiative, or that you can fairly say, he was too cautious. But the chief complaint very often seems to be that he withheld his support to Davout out of pure spite, and I don't think that's accurate.
It's interesting. Is the premise for that just purely that they have a fractious relationship and therefore, the rumour mill can work, or is there more to it? Are there sort of snide comments that are made either prior or after that kind of allude to something and fan the flames, if you like, of that gossip?
Yeah, Napoleon absolutely does, because he says afterwards famously that if it were not for concern of Désilet, he would have had Bernadotte shot. He would have had him court-martialed, and the necessary result of that would be that he was shot. So it purely comes from Napoleon.
Napoleon. Stirring the pot, who'd have thought it? We have a note in the show notes. Yes, prep is done for this. Rachel does a marvelous job in kind of pointing me in the directions of where we need to go with this. And the note is treatment of Swedish prisoners after Lubeck.
Yeah, so
we've got to talk about this.
In as much as Bernadotte's personality sort of holds him back because he gets into arguments continuously, his sense of personal integrity and the honour with which he treats prisoners fundamentally changes the course of his life. So he was obviously very much castigated for his role in Erstadt, and he sort of semi-redeems himself by taking part in the pursuit of the three marshals, where Napoleon says he's too reckless. So you do get the sense that realistically he probably couldn't win in Napoleon's estimation. But he takes a number of Swedish prisoners, and his conduct to them is everything that is decent and civilized and honourable and humane. And when they return to Sweden, they do so with an excellent memory of this French officer who conducted himself so well, behaved so civilly to them, and this pays off. When the succession crisis occurs in Sweden, and they need a French sort of name to put to the heir to the crown, he's the one that several Swedish officers who were members of the Swedish nobility put forward.
Interesting. And so the big one arrives. Because we were always going to get to this, weren't we? The succession crisis and the selection of Bernadotte. And we have talked about this before, in fairness, but I think it's so important and integral to the story that we have to kind of properly unpick this. So the upshot, quite obviously, is that Bernadotte ends up as the ruler of Sweden, and then promptly chooses to act like the ruler of Sweden rather than the puppet of Napoleon. Now, we talked about puppets in the last episode with Graham on precisely this point about at what point do you, as an individual, with your own thoughts and priorities, prioritize when you are crowned this idea that actually, yes, you probably need to do the job that you've been given and you need to show loyalty to that job. And at what point do you just go, no, actually, I'm just going to let Napoleon control me? Bearing in mind that, these are men in an era where if you were somebody's puppet, you would have been viewed as particularly unmasculine. So, and we're talking about a Gascon here who is like the archetypal D'Artagnan-esque figure who doesn't like being pushed around. So is it all that surprising?
Not in the slightest. And this seems to be, the dichotomies in Napoleon's character really interest and fascinate me, because he could be on one hand so shrewd and then the other hand staggeringly naive when he would install all these new crowned heads of Europe and then be astonished that they didn't govern in the interests of France. And surely nobody in their right mind can expect that Bernadotte would have done so for numerous reasons. Firstly, he had no blood claim to this throne. He was offered it, and he wasn't actually the top candidate. There were several other names put about. Napoleon particularly wanted it to go to his stepson, Eugene, who, knowing what we know of him, would have probably made a really good king. He was a fundamentally decent individual. But Bernadotte was the only one willing to convert from Catholicism to Lutheranism, which advanced him up the ladder. And Napoleon eventually gave his blessing. He took back Bernadotte's French nationality, released him from his oath of allegiance. So he's not a Frenchman anymore. He is a Swede. And the bit that always really astonishes me is that people seem to forget that Bernadotte became an officer during the French Revolution, when one of the chief criticisms lobbied at Marie Antoinette was that she prioritized Austrian interests over French. She was called l'Autrichienne, the Austrian bitch. And that was the chief complaint they had about her. And look what they did to her. He had seen what could happen to a ruler who was seen to govern in the interest of a country elsewhere and not their own. He had been given the crown. It was almost a contractual relationship. What was given could be taken away. And ultimately, it was never going to work. Their French interests and Swedish interests were diametrically opposed. So the Swedes wanted Bernadotte, who was obviously seen as a successful military officer, to take back territories. They wanted to either recover Finland or Norway. Now, Bernadotte is savvy enough to understand that going toe-to-toe with Alexander and Russia over Finland, not going to work. Norway's a much more realistic prospect, but Norway belongs to Denmark, and Denmark is an ally of Napoleon's. So that, by their very nature, sets him against Napoleon. However, Napoleon wants Sweden to practice the continental system, which was ultimately going to cripple its trade. And so, like every other example where he tried to forcibly input the continental system, it massively backfires because they go, stuff that, I'm going to do my own thing. It just doesn't work. And then Napoleon invades Swedish Pomerania. There is no option where this works out well, because their interests were diametrically opposed. And of course, he is going to react from the point of view of a Swede. He's not going to go, oh, well, but France, yay us, he's looking after his new crown. He is looking after his new people and reacting as they expect him to. If he had done any differently, we'd be talking about Marshal Bernadotte, the deposed king of Sweden, not Marshal Bernadotte, the founder of the extant Swedish dynasty.
You make that point incredibly well about Marie Antoinette. And it's not one that I'd ever dwelt on before, but it's absolutely key when you pause and think about why would he, and set the, okay, yes, you could very easily, and you can see why people draw this kind of, it's almost too easy, right? You see the fractious relationship with Napoleon, you see the fact that the guy then turns his back on Napoleon, and you go, well, it's all just consistent, the guy never liked him anyway, he's ungrateful, he's just a traitor, boo Bernadotte. It's a very kind of simple, draw a straight line between the two, happy days. But you've got to think about it from perspective. And this is one of the things that I often try and push in this podcast, that we use perspective. And this is where people rightly pull me up when I bash Napoleon, sometimes a little bit too much. And they will turn around and say, but yes, consider perspective X. To what extent did person X benefit, or type of person X benefit from Napoleon's rule? And there are people who benefited from Napoleon's rule. Of course there are. That's a given. But if you're going to use that perspective stance, you also need to apply it universally, which therefore means that you've got to put yourself in Bernadotte's shoes. And it's not an easy position to be in, actually. And I want to get on to Desiree as well, because that's going to be a really interesting kind of, what's her reaction to all of this. But before we get there, consider yourself as Bernadotte. You're given this. It's a really weird situation to be in. Brits who are listening, compare this to, for example, Charles II, when he's restored to the throne of England in 1660. He is gifted that crown, and that has a fundamental impact on how he rules, because he knows that he can't push the situation. He has to be governed to an extent by Parliament, even though he's king. It's a different situation, but the concerns and the way in which that influences your mindset are absolutely the same. If you're going to be given this, as you say, it can be taken away. So sure, you've got to put any prior loyalties to one side, and you've got to think pragmatically, and you've got to think about priorities. And the priorities actually in this situation are not being kicked out and potentially losing your head in the process. And as you say, he's not French anymore. He's had to renounce that.
Yeah.
So
the point is, and you've kind of summed that up, we're not writing a TV show here. We're not doing a play. This isn't the case where we can sort of make him an Iago or, a nice, convenient Claudius villain. He's not somebody who's been lurking at stage left with sort of villainous ambition. This is somebody who's put in a place where he has to govern within the confines of his role, where he has to act on his, I'm going to call it a contract, I lecture in business. So he's accepting his part of the contractual obligations where he must govern Sweden as appropriate. This isn't a melodrama. This is government. This is real life. And of course he acts accordingly. Even, the marshals most devoted to Napoleon, there's a limit if you put them in charge of somewhere, how much they can effectively go in blind loyalty. And this is where we start to see the discourse about Marmol. There is a line, and slavish blind obedience with no critical thought at all, no critical analysis, no balance. It's not really needed in the discussion. It doesn't accomplish anything. That's just argument.
It is. And actually it's a grounds to arguably think less of somebody. A lot of these marshals that we've talked about so far, deeply principled individuals. There will of course be others that we'll talk about that perhaps were arguably less principled, but Davout, massively principled. And Bernadotte, in his own way, he's got his lines that you just do not cross. And we've seen this in the discussion that we've had already. So this idea that, a man who all the way through his career has tried to do a thoroughly competent, decent job with the task that's in front of him should then go and do the same thing as the ruler of Sweden. What a surprise. Let's talk Desiree though. I'm hearing what you say about it'd be interesting to do an episode entirely on her life. We might just make that happen further down the line, actually. But What was her reaction like when when Bernadotte tells her, "Yeah, so this is my plan. This is what's going to happen."
Yeah,
Because you were talking earlier, she didn't want to have to leave France
no, she
when
really
he
didn't.
became prince. So how does it go down? I mean, I imagine kind of a whirlwind and things being thrown and all sorts.
Yeah, I mean, what a life she had. And when I did my blog series on the Marshal's wives, hers kept getting longer and longer and longer, and I thought I'm going to stop somewhere. She was devastated, and she recalled at the time she thought it was another thing like the Pontecorvo title. She thought it was going to be a sort of little dignity, no more. And when it was explained to her that she had to leave France, she was very genuinely devastated. So, and there's a point in Chandler, and I don't know whether it's true, but she had to look up Sweden in an atlas. But I'm not quite sure if that's just a little bit of condescension there. But she didn't join him there till 1811. She stayed in France and she did not like it. She clashed very much with the elderly queen, who thought she was a spoiled little girl, who just detested everything who wasn't French, was not interested in learning Swedish, was not interested in conforming in any way to the Swedish court. And she basically tried to get out of Sweden at every opportunity. And she came in 1813, she fled back to Paris, where she lived sort of semi incognito, if you can call it that, until 1823. So they were apart, like basically for a decade, and she was living in France. She just did not like Sweden at all, and she never did. She had a very, I would say, pretty unhappy later half of her life, and if she had remained Madame the Marshal Bernadotte or even Madame Bonaparte, I think she would have had a happier life than she did as a queen.
It's I'm sold already. It's happening. Not putting a date to it, folks, but at some point we're going to sit down and we're going to have that chat about Desiree. I'm almost wondering about a sub-series to do with the Marshal's wives, but I can't impose on you too much, so we'll have to have a conversation about when and where we might make that happen. Because it's important. We talk about these men. Let's not pretend that. I'm not going to do that cliche about behind every man is a woman, because actually beside every man is an equally important woman, and some of these women were real characters. Do we know what their relationship was like prior to this, though? Was it always a kind of iffy and tempestuous one, or was there genuine kind of, let's not call it domestic bliss, but genuine happiness in their relationship at times?
I think there was, to a degree, but she always called him Bernadotte, even after he became the king. And there's an anecdote, and I would have to go and dig it out because I didn't go through very much of my notes about Desiree, but there's an anecdote once they are in Sweden, and as king, he's thrown a massive tantrum about something. She comes along and basically says, "Oh, Bernadotte, you're always so dramatic, we can sort it out." So I don't think it was the most harmonious of all the Marshals' relationships, because he was, she cleared off back to France for a decade, and clearly I think France came first. She was very much attached to it. And certainly in his later life, it was noted that Bernadotte preferred the company of his sort of favourite courtier, Magnus Brahe, to the Queen. But I think they sort of got on with it eventually, because when she returned with their son's bride in advance of his wedding, Bernadotte forbade her from leaving Sweden ever again. And she basically was there for the rest of her days. And she outlived him.
Oh, really? So even after that's I want to rabbit hole, or you shouldn't have put that little teaser in there, because now I want to know why, but we can't go there. Oh, that's infuriating.
Yeah, she outlived him, and her son predeceased her. So when she died, her grandson was King of Sweden, and she became a noted eccentric later in her life. She would sort of sleep all day and get up all night and call on people at 4 a.m. And I mean, it's one interest in life.
Okay, yeah. Watch this space, people. That's all I'm going to say. You gave us a little teaser there about something that I think we should probably explore further, which is the relationship with Count Magnus Brahe. Why do they hit it off? Because we were discussing earlier, Bernadotte doesn't make friends easily, you know. So for somebody to get on well with this guy, does Brahe just have the patience of a saint?
I don't know. This is something I always feel that I want to explore more of and then never have the time. But they were genuinely very much attached to each other. To at some point there were dips in Bernadotte's popularity through his kingship, and one of the criticisms was that it was Brahe's rule, not Bernadotte's rule, and that he was sort of being influenced, sort of maliciously. It's difficult, and it was a very, very deep attachment, because after Bernadotte's death, Brahe wore a mourning ring with both their hair entwined, and if you Google it, you can see the ring. It's still in existence. So it's one of those things where you can't really accurately speculate, because was it just that they hit it off? Was it a very deep and sort of emotional friendship? Was it potentially even something more? Like, you don't know and you can't speculate, but it's an interesting avenue that a man who was so poor at making friends made such a devoted one.
That accusation that, it's actually Brahe's rule and not Bernadotte's, it doesn't strike me as consistent with the Bernadotte that we've been talking about. Is there any fairness to that accusation?
No, I don't think so. But when you read up on his kingship, he became that sort of adage that you become more conservative as you get older, and this sort of virulent Jacobin gets progressively more conservative. And in his later years, he does some of the stuff we complain about Napoleon doing. He censored the press. He became quite authoritarian in some ways. So again, if you're going to criticize one, you have to criticize the other. It's the balance in it. So he was a successful king in many ways, but there are criticisms. He did become very authoritarian.
Another one we have to talk about is the Sixth Coalition. This is where it gets properly awkward, right?
Yeah, he's fundamental to the forming of the Sixth Coalition. He meets with Alexander, and they basically agree that they will recognize each other's territory, and that he will basically allow Bernadotte to have Norway, which pleases the Swedish interests. And ultimately, they make war on France. So this general, Marshal of France, is fighting against his own comrades. But even amongst the allies, he does have this continuous reputation of not quite ever being where he's needed to be. He didn't get to Isla on time, for which he not unreasonably blamed Berthier. He missed Friedland because he was wounded, so he's always just never quite there. And then the allies sort of chided him for his slow progress around the sort of Battle of Leipzig. And he flies off on one at the British and the Prussians, and he reminds the Prussians who won at Lubeck, and basically says to the British, is this the reward for Sweden's loyalty in supporting you guys? So Blücher is not particularly enamored of Bernadotte. He doesn't think very highly of him. But ultimately, we see the coalition is successful, and eventually, if we can sort of call it, if I can be really facetious and call it the Napoleonic Game of Thrones, there's that line that Cersei Lannister says to Ned Stark in the book: when you play the Game of Thrones, you win or you die. Two of the marshals played the Game of Thrones, Bernadotte and Murat. Bernadotte won. And he ends the Napoleonic Wars in 1814, the Crown Prince of Sweden, who has achieved basically what he wants. There's a very quick sort of conquest of Norway. And in 1814, after Napoleon's abdication, he sort of calls on some of his former comrades. And we know that he meets with Ney, and he meets with Augereau and Marmont, and he tries to call on the Lefebvres, and who is just my favourite, and I love his wife. And Madame Lefebvre, who very infamously called a spade a spade, announced when he tried to call that she was at home, but she was not at home to turn coats, and he could basically get stuffed.
Ouch.
Yeah. So, but he wasn't always best pleased because, again, as I say, he was fantastically touchy bloke. He wasn't best pleased with his treatment by the Allies. And when the 100 days comes, he sits out once again. He doesn't get his hands dirty. He says he's given enough. He's done his part. The Allies can get on with it. And that kind of marks the end of his career. In 1818, he becomes a king. And the sort of chief irony is that Napoleon once threw over Desiree. He divorces Josephine because of her infertility. And it's Bernadotte's son who marries the daughter of Eugene. And so Josephine and Desiree, their descendants, are still on the thrones of Europe today. So talk about poetic justice in a way.
Ooh, that's got to sting, hasn't it? If you're Napoleon and you have that, if you knew that was how things were going to fall, yes. All that effort to build a dynasty, and actually it's his ex-wife and his ex-girlfriend that end up being responsible for a dynasty that outlasts most of the other European dynasties, quite frankly. Yeah. Wow. There are a few questions I want to pick up on in relation to the coalition thing. One side comment, I'm not surprised by the sitting out of the Seventh Coalition, partly because he's got what he wanted, right? You know, he wanted that exactly. He wanted that recognition of Norway as Swedish territory. And once he's got that, what more is he going to gain? What more are the Allies going to give him that he hasn't got already? You know, where's the value to it? So it doesn't surprise me at all from thinking about this guy as somebody who has a job to do in promoting Swedish interests, and having fulfilled them, it's like, yeah, thanks, done now. But the conquest of Norway, how involved is he in that as a military man? Because you say it was a straightforward thing, that doesn't overly surprise me, but you can't, position of ignorance here, full disclosure, I can't help but wonder how kind of hands-on he is in that process of, look, I'm a Marshal of France. I know what I'm doing. Just step back. Let me plan the campaign. Let me sort it all out. And as a result of that, you know, his skill kind of comes to the fore. I mean, could you even say that is his moment where he does shine?
Actually, now you've put it that way, yes. So you could say that he does have a finest hour in as much that conquest can be. It just happens to be a non-Napoleonic one. It's out of the Napoleonic theatre. Yeah, I never thought about it that way. That's probably quite fair. And again, that was the kind of thing he marketed himself to the Allies with. I understand Napoleon's methods. I understand warfare. I know what I'm doing. And that's how he was able to sort of ingratiate himself with the Allies. Because bear in mind, this is a Jacobin usurper. From their point of view, in some cases, as much as Napoleon was, he was the son of a lawmaker from Pau. He wasn't a prince. He wasn't born of the blood. So you can understand why they might have been marginally distasteful about having to work alongside Bernadotte. They certainly were working with Murat, but it works.
Interesting. And with the active involvement in the wars of the Second Coalition, is there any point at which he has to face off against former, I'm not going to call them friends because clearly he didn't have friends among the Marshalate, but you know, former colleagues, and has to kind of play a curious game where, you know, if you're facing your old colleagues, then you got to kind of feel a bit awkward. Do we have any of those instances and any indication about how he felt?
Yeah, he defeated Marshal Oudinot in 1813. There certainly doesn't seem to be any would then fight off against Ney. I think he seemed to feel that he was doing his duty, and he set another one of his big proclamations, where he sort of appealed to the people of France and the soldiers of France, and you know, we need to do the right thing. We can't have France be the scourge, and he calls it the scourge of the world, which didn't really go down particularly well with French citizens, because that's not the most complimentary thing your country's going to be called. But he certainly seemed to view it as he was doing what he should be doing, and that was his duty.
Interesting. It's I think we could probably talk for another solid hour, but I'm conscious of the clock already. I need more time, even though I've got endless time. I haven't really. There has to be a limit on these things, and we do need to just talk about you've got a note here about kingship in 1818. Talk us through that kind of post-Napoleonic era, that phase where, you know, he has to transition ultimately, doesn't have to, but does transition ultimately towards a new, more kind of ironically Napoleonic style of leadership.
Yeah.
More, you know, let's be okay, moment where I am going to be fair, you know, let's not be surprised by that. That's the model of kingship during this period. That's very consistent with the other rulers of Europe during this time. So fair play. I'm not even going to caveat that with my normal arguments about Napoleon and all the rest of it. Shouldn't be surprised by that. But yeah, talk us through that.
Yeah, he's generally accounted a success. So they say he was a cautious monarch. I quite enjoy this sentence: fond of making emotional speeches, no change. But he never quite got to grips with the language. He could never really fluently speak Swedish or Norwegian. His preferred language remained French. But there were there were peaks and troughs. There were certain periods where his popularity really did plummet. There was at least one assassination attempt. But by the time of his Silver Jubilee, he'd kind of, got the public sort of back on board. Sweden's generally considered to have prospered during his reign even. But basically, here's the account I was talking about earlier on. When he threatened to deal with a student unrest by making the gutters run with blood, he was losing his rag and having a massive tantrum. That's when Desiree says, "Oh, Bernadotte, everybody knows you couldn't even kill a kitten."
Turn around and tell a Marshal of France, "Nah, sit down, mate. You couldn't even kill a kitten."
So yeah, I mean, he was criticised in the liberal press in the 1830s, and this is when we start to see the sort of more authoritarian elements of censoring and suppressing the press. Which, again, my point is, if you're going to compare the two, there's so many parallels between Bernadotte and Napoleon. You can't make fish of one and fowl of the other. If we're going to criticise Napoleon for censoring the press, so too must we criticise Bernadotte, and just in the way where we sort of can admire Napoleon's ambition and drive in taking power for his own. You kind of have to do the same with Bernadotte. The only real differences between the two of them was Bernadotte was a savvy politician and Napoleon really wasn't. And Bernadotte was an okay general, Napoleon's a superlative one. Other than that, there are a lot of different parallels. But yeah, so if we're going to consider who won the Napoleonic Game of Thrones, I would say it's Bernadotte.
It's a nice point on which to kind of wrap things up, but I am going to throw one final question out there. Legacy. How would you sum up his legacy?
It's a funny one, because the minute you mention his name in any Napoleonic discourse, he is regarded by a huge swathe of sort of people who are on the pro-Napoleonic side of the fence to be a traitor, and is despised. And you look at some of the comments on my recent tweets: Davout should have fought a duel with him, Davout should have bloodied his nose, and all this kind of comments. Napoleon should have shot him. So he had an excellent Revolutionary War, not quite as successful Napoleonic War, because he was very often not what he needed to be, not always through his fault. But the chief legacy, I guess, has to be the fact that his descendants still rule. The House of Bernadotte is still extant when plenty of other European houses have crumbled. Napoleon's dynasty didn't last particularly long, through the very tragic loss of his only legitimate son. We know what happened to the Romanovs. We know what happened to the Austro-Hungarian Empire. So when you look at all the various sort of major figures of the time and their legacies, Bernadotte's about the only one still standing. If we just count the British monarchy as well, of course.
Sure, but the British monarchy goes through a whole series of phases and changes. Absolutely. I said that was the last one. I'm just going to give you the chance to rant, should you wish to. I mean, you're a very kind of calm and collected individual. You're not a Bernadotte, certainly from my dealings with you. But the haters, because they do love to come at you, and we said when we prepped this one that they were going to come for you with this one. So I just want to give you the opportunity, because you've been very kind of measured and thoughtful, and hopefully people have listened, but just to kind of get your retaliation in first, head off those predictable comments, because utmost respect to people, if you move in these circles and if you study these periods and you talk about this stuff often enough, you end up seeing the same things time and time again. So I'm going to give Rachel just the opportunity to head off the common arguments that people often love to throw out there. So what would your message be to the inverted commas haters?
I can do no better than leave you with the words of Napoleon himself. Bernadotte had become a sort of Swede, and he had made no promise to remain true. I can accuse him, therefore, of ingratitude, but not of treason. And if you want to come with an argument, that's great, but make sure you've got your critical analysis right, because if you can't argue objectively, then that's just mudslinging.
Boom. Mic dropped. Rachel, always a joy, folks. You'll find Rachel on Twitter at bookish_Rachel, Rachel spelled Rachel. You'll find a myriad of brilliant tweets and threads on the Marshals and on the Marshals' wives significantly. And Rachel, I know you'll be back very soon. As ever, thank you for the prep behind this. The hours that go in are brilliant. It's been another belter. It's been an absolute joy as well. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
A huge thank you, as ever, to my Patreon supporters, my Emperor-level patrons Mark Stoos, JC Kaiser, and Todd and Laird Campbell. My Marshal patrons Matt Bone, Marcus Cribb, Rachael Stark, Roy Muir, Liam Telfer, Ger Brown and Graham Swidenbank. My Commander patrons John Haynes, Jane Davis, Bob Burnham, Andy Meakin, Michael Guest and Ross Flowers. And my mentioned in Dispatches patrons Noah Fink, Andrew Wright, David Maxwell, M. Duck, Anthony Gumbow, Chris Pramus, Miles Reedy, Alexandra Leon, Alistair Campbell-Grieve, Beatrice de Graaf, Brendan Teeling, Colin Fieldhouse, Ed Koss, Bruins Girl, Gareth Copeland, Jeff Maple, Hugh Brennan, Indiana Fats, Jim Deary, Jim Getz, Josh Keeney, Lucy Tatner, Lim Dawson, Mark Anscombe, Rob Griffith, Ryan Diamond, Rob Coughlin, Mark Trowbridge, Nick Overland, Stephen Colson, Graham Goodwin, Graham Spicer, Keys Bishop, and David Preece. I'll be back very soon, but until then, I'm Zach White. This has been The Napoleon Assist. Take care of yourselves, my friends. Stay well, stay safe, and as always, thank you for listening.